I've been working as a security guard at the old abandoned factory for 6 months now. It's a night shift job, and I work alone most of the time. My job is pretty straightforward: make sure no one breaks in, patrol the perimeter, and check the surveillance cameras every hour. I thought it was a boring job, but I was wrong. The factory is haunted, and I'm not alone here. It all started on my second week on the job. I was doing my rounds when I heard footsteps coming from the upper floor. I froze for a moment, thinking that someone had broken in, but then I remembered that I had locked all the doors and windows. I took my flashlight and climbed the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. As I reached the top of the stairs, the footsteps stopped. I looked around but saw nothing. I thought it might have been my imagination, but I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was watching me. From that day on, strange things started to happen. Every night, I would hear footsteps, whispers, and creaking sounds. Sometimes, I would see shadows moving on the walls, and my flashlight would flicker on and off. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But the incidents became more frequent and intense. I couldn't deny it anymore. Something was wrong with this place. One night, I decided to check the surveillance cameras to see if I could catch anything unusual. The cameras showed nothing out of the ordinary until I reached the last one. It showed a figure standing in the middle of the factory floor, its back facing the camera. It was too dark to see the face or any details, but I knew it wasn't human. My blood froze in my veins, and I couldn't move for a moment. I switched to the live feed, but there was nothing there. I thought I was going crazy, but the fear I felt was too real. I started to do some research on the factory's history and found out that it used to be a textile mill in the 1800s. It was shut down in the 1930s, and no one had used it since then. I also discovered that many workers had died in accidents and that there were rumors of a fire that killed dozens of people. Some said that their spirits still haunted the place, seeking revenge for their untimely deaths. I tried to quit my job, but I needed the money, and no one else wanted to work there. I was trapped, and the ghosts knew it. They started to torment me more frequently, and I couldn't sleep or eat. I felt like I was losing my mind. I tried to ignore them and focused on my job, but it was becoming impossible. One night, as I was patrolling the upper floor, I heard a loud noise coming from the basement. It sounded like metal hitting concrete. I knew I had to investigate, but I was scared. I took a deep breath, grabbed my flashlight, and descended the stairs. As I reached the bottom, I saw something that made me scream. A figure was standing in the middle of the basement, holding a bloody hammer. It was covered in dirt and grime, and its eyes were lifeless. I couldn't see the face, but I knew it was one of the factory workers who had died in the fire. It didn't move or say anything, but I knew it wanted to kill me. I ran as fast as I could up the stairs, but I could hear the figure following me. Its footsteps were heavy, and it was getting closer with each passing moment. I could feel its breath on the back of my neck, and I knew I had to do something before it was too late. I turned around and aimed my flashlight at the figure, hoping it would scare it away. But instead, it only made it angrier. The figure lunged at me with a hammer, and I dodged just in time. I could feel the wind of the hammer swing on my face, and I knew I was lucky to be alive. I ran to the exit, hoping to escape, but the doors were locked from the outside. I was trapped, and the figure was getting closer. My body suddenly got super hot and I blacked out. When I woke up it was daytime and my clothes were torn and I had a few large scratch marks on my chest. It took me a while to get up and gain my balance, but when I did I quickly left the factory. When I got home I immediately called my boss and quit. I decided my life was not worth the risk that came with the night shift security job. I have been working as a nurse in the emergency department of a small hospital for 2 years now. I work the night shift, and it's usually quiet, with only a few patients coming in. But one night, everything changed. It was a night that I will never forget. I was sitting at my desk, charting my patient's progress when I heard a strange noise coming from one of the patient rooms. It sounded like someone was gasping for air. I stood up and walked towards the room, thinking that one of my patients was having trouble breathing. But when I entered the room, I found something that made my blood run cold. The patient in the room was lying on the bed, his face twisted in pain, and his eyes bulging out of his sockets. He was gasping for air, but his mouth was foaming, and his skin was turning blue. I knew that he was having a severe allergic reaction, but there was no sign of any medication or allergen in the room. I called the doctor on call and asked him to come to the patient's room as soon as possible. I was trying to keep the patient calm, but he was in too much pain. Suddenly, the patient stopped breathing, and his heart rate dropped to 0. I tried to resuscitate him, but it was too late. He was dead. I was in shock, and I couldn't believe what had just happened. I called the doctor, and he came to the room with a team of nurses. They tried to revive the patient, but it was too late. He was gone. As the team was preparing the patient's body for the morgue, I heard another noise coming from the same room. It was a faint whisper, and I couldn't make out what it was saying. I thought it might be one of the nurses, but when I turned around, I saw something that made me scream. Standing at the door was a figure dressed in a hospital gown, its face twisted in pain, and its eyes were empty. It was the same patient who had just died. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The figure started walking towards me, and I could feel its cold breath on my face. I was frozen with fear, and I couldn't move. Suddenly, the figure disappeared, and I was left alone in the room. I tried to calm myself down, thinking that it was just my imagination, but the feeling of dread lingered in my mind. I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was wrong. As the night progressed, strange things started to happen. The lights in the hallway flickered on and off, and I could hear footsteps coming from the empty patient rooms. The air in the hospital felt thick and heavy, and I could feel a presence watching me. I tried to ignore it and focus on my work, but it was becoming impossible. Every time I entered a patient's room, I could feel the presence of the dead patient watching me. I knew that I had to do something before it was too late. I decided to investigate the patient's death and see if there was anything unusual about it. I went through his medical records and discovered that he had no allergies or any underlying medical conditions that could have caused his death. I also found out that he was not alone in the room when he died. He had a visitor who had left just before he started to have the allergic reaction. I decided to track down the visitor and see if they had anything to do with the patient's death. I found out that the visitor was a young woman who was a friend of the patient's. She had come to visit him that night, and she had left just before he started having the allergic reaction. I tracked her down and asked her if she had noticed anything unusual about the patient or the room. She told me that everything was normal, and she had left before anything happened. But something about her story didn't feel right. I decided to dig deeper and discovered that the young woman had a history of mental illness and had been a patient in the psychiatric ward of the hospital a few years ago. I decided to investigate further and went to the psychiatric ward to talk to some of the staff. They told me that the young woman had been admitted after a severe psychotic episode and had been treated with electroconvulsive therapy. She had been released after showing signs of improvement, but her mental state had always been unstable. I knew that something was not right, and I decided to confront the young woman. I asked her if she had anything to do with the patient's death, and she broke down in tears. She confessed that she had been hearing voices telling her to kill the patient and that she had injected him with a lethal dose of a drug. I was shocked, and I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I called the police and handed her over to them. But even after the young woman was arrested, the strange things in the hospital continued. I could feel the presence of the dead patient following me everywhere I went. I could hear his whisper in the empty hallways, and I could see his ghostly figure standing at the end of the corridor. The hospital was haunted by the patient's ghost, and I knew that I had to leave before it was too late. I resigned from my job at the hospital and moved to another city. But even now, years later, I still can't forget the night shift from hell. The memory of the patient's death and the haunting presence in the hospital still lingers in my mind, and I know that I will never forget that night. I was a security guard at a large manufacturing plant that operated around the clock. My job was to patrol the facility and ensure that everything was secure. Most nights, it was a quiet and uneventful job, but there was one night that I would never forget. It started off like any other night. I did my rounds, checking the doors and windows, and ensuring that everything was locked up tight. But as I made my way through the factory floor, I heard a strange noise coming from one of the machines. It sounded like a tapping or knocking sound, and it seemed to be coming from deep within the machine. At first, I thought it was just a mechanical issue, but as the noise continued, I started to feel uneasy. I approached the machine and tried to locate the source of the sound, but it was difficult to pinpoint. Suddenly, The tapping sound turned into a series of loud bangs that echoed through the factory. I knew that I needed to investigate further, so I climbed up onto the machine to get a better look. As I peered into the darkness, I saw something move. It was a pair of glowing eyes that seemed to be staring back at me. I froze in terror, not knowing what to do. The eyes seemed to be getting closer, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was a man, dressed in a torn and ragged jumpsuit. His skin was pale and clammy, and his eyes were sunken and hollow. He had a wild look in his eyes, and I could see that he was holding something in his hand. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling. The man didn't answer. Instead, he lunged at me with a rusty pipe, and I stumbled backward, barely avoiding the blow. I knew that I needed to get out of there, so I ran as fast as I could towards the exit. But the man was fast, and he was hot on my heels. I burst through the door and ran out into the night air, gasping for breath. I could hear the man's footsteps behind me, but I didn't dare look back. Finally, I reached my car and fumbled for my keys. I quickly got in and locked the doors, looking back to see the man standing in the doorway, staring at me with his glowing eyes. I called the police and reported the incident, but when they arrived, there was no sign of the man. The machine that he had emerged from had been shut down for years, and nobody knew how he had gotten inside. I quit my job at the manufacturing plant the next day, and I never returned to that place again. To this day, I still have nightmares about the pale, wild-eyed man, and I know that I will never forget that terrifying night.